Great. So a few housekeeping things as we get started and people come in here. Most of all, want to introduce Peter Isaacs, who's all the way in Australia in Melbourne this morning. It is, I guess 7 a.m. your time. So first off, a big thank you for coming out and sharing some knowledge early your time.
No problems. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the first kind of expert conversations we're having, and a little bit more of like a Q&A style open format. As you can tell, this is not a traditional, webinar where you can pop on camera. Feel free to turn your mic on, chime in with a question. We're going to go through a deck with mostly just kind of open-ended questions. Peter just went through the process, and we'll give some more context on this, but just went through the process on his own team of scaling an entire conversation design workflow, which it sounds like, based on the registration that we did see, a lot of people here are designers on their own teams, or part of a conversational AI process. So hopefully this helps. And if you have a question specific for Peter, you can drop it in the chat. Tara, who's also on camera here, will be monitoring the chat. And if you want to hop on and ask your question via video or audio, or just drop it in the chat, she'll be more than happy to level it up, and we can pass it on to Peter. So great. I will get started and actually throw it right over to Peter for a little bit of overview on you as a designer, and then obviously WooliesX as well.
Sure. Cool. So I guess to start, I've been in conversation design for maybe like 4 years, thereabouts. I used to work for Australia's biggest telephone company, Telstra, doing their chatbot. And, in between that, I've kind of also, my background's actually copywriting. So I worked in advertising a lot, doing as a creative. And yeah, that's kind of my professional history. As far as WooliesX, we are like the digital arm of the Woolworths Group. The Woolworths Group has Woolworths, which is Australia's biggest shopping kind of outlet. I guess it would be similar to trying to remember who is in the US. I've gone completely blank. But we also have big brands like Big W, which I guess is kind of like a Target. We've got lots of booze shops and, something like 150,000 staff or something ridiculous. Oh, no, 15,000 staff, sorry, internally. And we have like internal bots and internal things that we all manage and all that sort of thing as well. So, yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. I appreciate the background. I think it helps set a little bit, because obviously anyone in the US or non-Australia can't really understand that without like scope and size and some comparisons. So, based on that size, the transition that you just went through is not just like a 2-person team or like a 5-person stakeholder bit. You were going through a lot, and candidly, we just did a case study on the work you did, and obviously anyone can help, hop on the Voiceflow blog and read that. But I think today, although, yeah, we'll touch on some of the work that we do mention there, this is really a time for you to kind of dig into like those questions that you had to ask yourself before bringing it to your other designers, before bringing a new workflow to stakeholders, and especially developers, right? Wes, we'll touch on that as well. So let's hop into the old workflow, right? I think, we spent maybe an hour or two kind of talking about your old workflow, and some of the things you had said is like, how do you have time to actually design, right, when you're worried about the logistics? So maybe you can level set for everyone here and anyone who's watching after the fact about what was your initial design workflow like before using Voiceflow or any sort of like central source of truth for design.
Yeah, so I mean, we worked on a tool called Lucidchart a lot. It's the same as Whimsical or any kind of flow charting software. And I think for the most part it worked pretty well. However, I guess we would spend a lot of time designing complex things. I guess it was just really complex to make things complex, if that makes sense, because all your logic relied on multiple kind of if blocks, and the same thing as what we would call an if block in Voiceflow, but you would have to have an if block for every kind of scenario, rather than boshing it all in one. So yeah, the workflow, I guess I would get a brief from the product owner saying we want to create this journey. Maybe I'd get a bit of data from it. Maybe that the request to create the journey would come from stakeholders like the call center or someone who owned a part of the website and they wanted a journey regarding to that part of the website. So I would go in and design that, have a 1 hour meeting with the product owner where I'd take him through the whole design. And, I guess to show him what the design was like, I'd have to read through each step.
Yeah, I thought that was the most interesting part that you shared with me, right? Because you're not actually doing any sort of design in those moments, right? You're actually just like when you say Lucidchart, was it a PDF or were you actually like using the charts you were spanning across the canvas, but yet someone was over your shoulder or via Zoom, for example?
Yeah. So we'd be in the actual project file itself and all via Zoom or Google Hangouts as we use. But yeah, so it was all done via that way. And it was quite a slow process because you can't kind of taking people down repair paths or like the unhappy path and all that sort of stuff. It takes a lot of time, especially with big designs. So yeah, that was kind of the process. And I guess we would have, rounds of feedback, or the product owner was like, I actually wanted to do this. Like maybe something wasn't briefed clearly enough. So I'd go back and change it. Then when he was happy, I'd take it to the tech lead and whoever the developer was working on that project. Once they saw that, it would then get, torn to shreds. Our APIs can't do this, blah, 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 or, that sort of thing. And then I would redesign, go back, keep having this like feedback process, which, we still have that feedback process. It's definitely not as long.
The old workflow was kind of like an assembly line, right? And you and I kind of came to that as maybe for the audience here, can you describe why it was an assembly line in the sense of like segmented silo workflow? Like you would sometimes not see a design after it was handed off, right? Like it was kind of just to development and then into the ether a little bit, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, why it was like that, I guess the team was already mature when I got here, so it was just kind of like that. So I couldn't exactly give you a reason why. But yeah, we would basically spend lots of time iterating on design. There wasn't any real user testing. Having said that, a lot of what we do at Woolies is, release something into the wild and then see what happens. And then development, I guess, because that was such a big piece, especially, if we were we do quite complex things at Woolies, I guess. We're doing full refunds, automated refunds on our IVR and chat, and that money goes back into your account almost instantly and that sort of thing. Like, so we're doing quite like involved things when it comes to development. But yeah, it used to go design, development, and then once the development was done, training would come and train those individual intents, which is a bit of a weird way to do it. We now quite often have training kind of at the start, at least getting all the utterances, and then we'd launch. And after launch, it would be really that moment of kind of being on Data Studio, watching the feed come in, making sure that everything is working, and adding new utterances and that sort of thing as we went.
And I don't think that the training part is such an integral part of like flipping a workflow. And it's not something that I think that only was Woolies, right? We hear that from so many teams that the old way just made sure that you would have to train and almost add in intents and utterances after design. And you're designing blindly at that point, right? Like you're designing with a general idea of what the feature is, but you don't actually have the dialogue data to make a well-rounded out feature. Is that accurate?
Yeah, definitely. I would make lots of assumptions on things. So, for instance, I wouldn't necessarily know the kind of entities. I would have a rough idea of the kind of entities that we would use. I would have everything would be kind of, I think this is how people are going to use the tool and how they're going to say things, which I guess is, you know, and that's all coming from my personal experience and as a person. Like I'm making up training phrases and all that sort of stuff. And, you know, I've seen a lot of people recently talk about you know, language diversity and all that sort of thing. And, you know, if I'm doing that, then it's only coming from me. And that's obviously not overly diverse. And obviously then the train model isn't going to work that well.
Customer data of one, if you're the one just designing without any information.
Exactly.
I think one of the questions that I'm curious about that we didn't really get on too much was like, what made you realize you needed a new workflow as a designer? And I think this question is important because other designers on this call probably need to figure out what that question is for themselves, right?
Yeah, for sure. I guess there wasn't like a singular moment, or I guess a kind of like a come to Jesus moment where I was like, oh, we need this. You know, when I got hired by Woolies, the tech lead kind of talked to me about my design style and other people's design styles. And what we kind of had was every designer that came in had a different design style, which meant that every time something would be built, a developer would have to kind of spend, you know, mental effort working out what they meant. So as part of, you know, joining the team, I created a design system, style guide, whatever you want to call it, for Lucidchart, which basically had, you know, this is what we use to represent an intent. This is what we use to represent an utterance. This is what we use to represent a question or a speech block or fallbacks, blah, 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 blah. So it was super effective. Like it worked really well. Developers found it really easy to read. So it was effective at communicating, but it was also super complex. The amount of time that I would spend designing in complex logic that I guess now I don't have to spend that much time, or comparatively. You know, we had to do versions with, if we were doing something voice, we would have to do versions for stakeholders and versions for developers, which, you know, the developers ones would feature things like SSML. That would feature all the terms that were in the design, which, you know, which doesn't matter as much to a stakeholder. And you know, as we saw before, I was trying to load a Lucidchart. The big master diagrams that we had were starting to chug a lot. And yeah, as we've also talked about, you know, dev handoffs were super long. You know, multiple 1 to 2 hour sessions happening all the time.
And that was an interesting part too with the SSML, right? Where you were asking one static chart to communicate visually with stakeholders who didn't need to understand the underlayer, but yet didn't have enough depth to communicate with developers quickly and repeatedly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, spot on. I guess in terms of when did we actually start looking at conversation design tools? At Woolies, we have this thing, and I think Google do this as well. I think a lot of what Woolies does, we kind of look at what Google does and go, yeah, that's cool. So we have this thing called chapter time, and 1 day a week we get to spend on improving what we do as a team, I guess improve our skills in a related field. So part of what I did was start to look at conversation design tools and try learn them and see if it would help and that sort of thing. So I tested multiple tools, including Voiceflow, BotMock, and Bot Society. And, you know, ultimately we picked Voiceflow, and probably a good thing since both those companies I don't think exist anymore.
Yeah, for sure. So then with, you had talked to, I think the biggest point that people probably can take from this is that condensing that 1 to 2 hour prototype session, right? I guess I would call it not even a prototype. It was a kind of a Wizard of Oz type test, right? Like, and then you go here, and then you go here. What was there any sort of measurement or like feedback process in that? Because I think a lot of times designers are measured on the prototypes that they create and share and get approved. But when you don't really have a prototype tool, what were you getting measured on, or what was like the feedback process like on a static flow chart?
I guess we measured things based on how it performed at launch, but not during the actual design process. So yeah, but as far as prototypes, I guess like we didn't really prototype. We did those flowcharts, read them aloud. Then people would go, "Oh, what happens if at this point if someone says this?" And you know that's kind of about as in depth as we went with them. But what we measured, I guess, post launch would be things like fallback rate. Like, did it increase or decrease with the launch of that new intent or that journey? The success rate of a flow, so how many turns did it take for someone to do what they wanted to do? Plus, you know, general conversation analysis, like, you know, reading logs and seeing how that worked.
Yeah, but that, and again, that was all after launch. You didn't really have any insight pre-launch and really low customer data to even influence the design at the front end, right?
Yeah.
And I think we kind of hit on this as well, but so you just talked about devs, you know, on the stakeholder side of things, you know, was there any pain points from the stakeholder when you were just using flowcharts, or did they know that there was a problem? Because I think a lot of times when we're talking about redoing a workflow, you know, or even tooling in general, a lot of times those stakeholders need to be bought in just as much as the users, right? Or as like the day-to-day users. Was there any pain point there that you were like, oh, hey, I have a solution for you? Or were they ever asking for a new tool? Or was it more of a show and tell after the fact?
Yeah, they weren't asking for a new tool as such, but there definitely were points where we would launch something, they were like, oh, I didn't know it did that. And it's just like, what? Because we couldn't necessarily show them through a design or in its entirety, and they couldn't necessarily read a design in its entirety. There was a bit of friction at that sort of point. Yeah.
Yeah, so they didn't know that there was a problem because they didn't know, right? You had to, that it's friction post-launch versus seeing that up front. Gotcha.
Which is obviously in a way like kind of the worst friction to have, because once you've built it, it's a lot hard to take parts apart and then rebuild it.
Absolutely. I think last questions on the old workflow before we hop into the new workflow here. I think a lot of people here might be asking, like, what are the words, or what are those initial conversations to have to rethink a workflow, right? And I'm talking as tactically as like, did you turn to the designer to your left or Zoom call the designer to your right and say, hey, we need this? Or was it something with your tech lead first? Like, what was that? What were those early conversations like for you?
Yeah, sure. So I guess part of that chapter time thing where we look at design tools, I did a presentation to the whole team being like, look at this cool stuff that I found. And there definitely was positive kind of positiveness from the presentation. So then we decided to try and do one flow using it. With that, we got quite a lot of buy-in from the product owner who, you know, at the time was, you know, couldn't hear the voice of the bot at all or anything like that, and really loved that sort of aspect of it. But we actually got quite a bit of pushback from development, and that was because I think partly using the new tool, we'd made, I guess I'd probably made things more complex, and part of that was I just didn't really know how to use Voiceflow, so I was kind of ramming everything together and trying to make it work and that sort of thing. So yeah, we got a lot of buy-in from the product owner. So he kind of helped lead that kind of, I think that we need this tool thing, which was really great. And then basically we ended up just using it on one bot, because we'd got 2 new devs to work on that bot, so they hadn't been exposed to the old way. So for them, it didn't really matter either way.
Yeah.
And, as we worked on those, we ended up like, I guess, getting lots of feedback from them about how to design better. I think the biggest thing that I can say is like we've had this constant communication with our developers on how to design so that they understand everything that we're designing, because ultimately they're kind of the main audience for our flows. And then it was slowly rolled out across other bots. But I think a big part of us being able to do that was we've also been in constant communication with you guys going, this thing doesn't work for our process, or this block, like if you could do this, it would make it way easier for us, and that sort of thing. Yeah. So I guess it's been this kind of constant communication between the developers and both you guys as well.
I think one of the things, and you said it a couple of times to me, that I find fascinating and actually a pretty good perspective for designers, is thinking about the development team as an audience, right? Yes, you're designing for the customer experience, but yet if you can create an artifact that's easy to hand off, easily digestible and repeatable for the developers, they're going to completely want to adopt a new workflow because it's making their life easier, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And I think it's so powerful, because I think if design and development and even like user testing are living in silos, everyone's going to butt heads. But yet if a designer can convince a developer that this is going to make their life better, and you do, both of your workflows are going to probably be more creative and more well built overall.
Exactly. I think actually one other thing which I remember, one conversation that I had with our tech lead was like, please let me use this tool. It's way more fun than flowcharts, which I think is like actually quite a powerful argument, because, if you're all of a sudden, not that I didn't enjoy conversation design, but I didn't enjoy spending hours and hours like designing out complex logic and that sort of thing. Like if you can make my job more fun, then you've got more chance of having retention and all those sorts of things. So
absolutely. We got a question sent via chat. Knowing what you know now, how would you present a new tool differently with your internal stakeholders? Like, I think I have a question kind of like that, but would you do anything differently if you could do it again?
So in terms of Voiceflow, I think I probably would, I would like, I have a tendency to be like, this is definitely the best thing that we should do, and kind of force it down people's throats. So I probably would have gone a bit slower. But I think part of that, like once we'd signed up and everything, we started having this constant communication with you guys and being like, this needs to change, or this needs to be fixed up. So in a way, kind of having that friction has ended up in having a better tool for us to use. In terms of presenting a new tool, I guess one that we actually got in recently was Human First, which is a kind of NLU tool where it helps you build a model, and it helps you find semantically similar utterances and build like a whole kind of thing. I had a much better ability to create a kind of case study, be like, this is why we should use this tool, because our trainers currently spend hours reading through logs and blah, blah, blah. Like doing it for a design tool is kind of a bit harder in a way, because it's a bit more ephemeral. But yeah, I mean, one of the things that I kept saying was, it's like we're using MS Paint rather than using Figma or Photoshop or something like that.
From a graphic design perspective, you're saying, right?
Yeah.
In terms of capabilities and layering, right?
Yeah.
Would you still, I know you talked about you started with one flow, you rebuilt one flow. Would you still do it that way? I guess for someone else going conversation.
Yeah, look, that wasn't actually rebuilding one flow. It was adding a new flow onto an already complex bot. I think potentially what I might have done was tried to rebuild what already existed, actually, to show, hey, this is what it would look like in this tool. That's actually a really good shout. Because one of the ways that we actually got people on board with everything was we have an insurance product as part of Woolies, and we have a huge flowchart which shows everything for insurance. And I rebuilt the whole insurance bot using Voiceflow. And as part of that, I would go to the developer, hey, like if I did this, does this make sense to you? And if they went, yep, I'd go, cool. Or they'd go, no, I think you need to do something like this. And then again, it's that constant communication with your developer being like, does this make sense?
Yeah. You've also said a couple of developers, which is a theme. Would you say maybe find, as much as you are a champion for a new workflow on the design team, do you need a developer champion in order to kind of spin up an initial prototype and pitch to make it scale? Would you offer that advice to people?
Yeah, I mean, if you can get a developer on side who likes using it and sees the value, then totally. I think I had a bit of a struggle in that the developers were very used to what they were used to, and they really liked what we had. So I guess it's kind of hard to switch people on over from a if it ain't broke, don't fix it kind of vibe.
Yeah, totally fair. How about this? I think we kind of started to touch a little bit on the flow. So let's hop to the end of this and go into the case study, because I think people would love to see kind of the chart versus the Voiceflow that you spun up. So I'll flip over to that here quickly. And I can kind of let you drive. Obviously, I'll handle the slides, but if you want to give us a little bit of context to this confidence approach and what it means for kind of
for sure. So one of the things that we noticed a lot in conversation logs was that we were hitting intents at relatively low confidence, and to stop delivering bad content, essentially. So it's getting into winter in Melbourne and I'm starting to get colds now. So unfortunately not always sunny in Australia. So we were noticing that we were hitting intents at low confidence. So we decided to, I guess, design a component, I guess you'd call it, that can sit in front of intents and kind of do all the confidence passing and confirm things and all that sort of thing if we needed to do it. So I guess this is what it would look like in actually a kind of less detailed way, using Lucidchart. So it's kind of hard to explain it, but the top part, I believe, is our is that it working? I need to actually get the Lucidchart up. Give me a sec.
No problem.
Lucidchart. Sorry, give me 2 seconds.
Yeah, because you rebuilt, because you had done this in Voiceflow, but then for this you went back and actually rebuilt it in Lucidchart just to show the side by side. So that's
exactly. So this was it was never actually made in Lucidchart. I just created the simple version. Here we go. Confidence approach. Oh, where are you gone? There we go. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen and you can kind of even see how we used to present things internally.
That'd be great.
So, all right. So, in this example, we've done it on an FAQ for points, for rewards. This little thing here means an intent, and that's the utterance that it has. So once we do that, we set the intent category to points. Then the confidence, so if it's above 70%, then we set the flow count to +1. The reason that we've done this is because we were seeing people hit things with high confidence to intents that they didn't actually really want to hit, but then they would ask the same question over and over and get in this kind of death spiral of, hitting the same content over and over again, and they would get really frustrated. And then they'd start swearing at the bot and then go to a CSR angry. So then we do a flow count check. Is it less than 2 times? Then we would check, are we in business hours? And then we go, oh, sorry, is it over 2? And so if we can, then we can offer a transfer. If we can't, then we'd say, sorry, we can't offer a transfer. If it's less than 2 points, 2 flow count points, then we deliver the content. Here we've got the question that we usually write the question that we've asked there, and then here's your fallbacks and that sort of thing. Then with the say the confidence is mid, so 30 to 69%. Then we will go down here. We've set the intent name to everyday rewards. So it's everyday rewards points even. There's a little typo. Then, so we would say something like, just to confirm, this is about everyday rewards points. Then they would go yes or no. If they say no, then we transfer because we obviously aren't going to get that right. And then again, we go back to got a question about everyday rewards points, ask me a question basically. Then finally, we have what we were calling the global fallback flow. So that's when you've got confidence of 1 to 29%. And then we would set the fallback count to +1.
Oh.
And then if the fallback equals 1, we'd say, I think you're asking something related to points, but I'm not sure what. Here are a few things I can help with. Or just rephrase your question. There's the buttons. So this is all chat, by the way.
Yeah.
And then similarly, once you hit it again, sorry, do you mind rephrasing that for me? And then finally, it's a transfer to an agent.
So it's like here, obviously, it's like you have all the conversation design best practices, like the way you can speak to this. It almost seems digestible because you're speaking to it so well. But when someone else would come in here, like you're talking about so many different shapes, logic, you have to build in the logic into the form of shapes, right? So like that becomes a whole nother key.
Yeah. So I mean, we would add this to everything so that someone could go back and see what everything was. So you got a bot response, speech decision points, speech patterns, disambiguation, intents with direct access through an utterance. So we'd use them if you wanted to skip through a journey. So maybe you say, in an example of refund, I want a refund of the cream in my last order. We would go, okay, we know what the product is, so you can skip through to there. That's where we want to hold content. So that's where I would kind of show this entity is, we want to hold that as a kind of context. Back-end decision point. So that's like all those logic bits. An external action, so maybe send an SMS, transfer to agent, fallbacks, no inputs, user inputs, next step, and then
So obviously a little bit different in Voiceflow. Do you want me to share my screen, or do you want to hop in your canvas to show that?
Yeah, look, I'll whip up a project and
perfect. Yeah, you might have to go ahead and share that tab once it's.
Yeah, sorry, it's just loading. I'm waiting to.
Okay, no problem.
So I can show the exact same one. So points. Where are you? This is obviously using all the new topics thing, which has been good. This bot actually, which you're seeing, is a completely redone bot of our rewards thing. So we've actually, the new topics thing's been really useful to kind of categorize everything and all that sort of thing. So anyway, so here we've got this is the intent. For anyone who uses Voiceflow, that's kind of obvious. We've got our set intent category. The reason that we have the intent category is in the global fallback kind of response, we will go, I think you're talking about points, or I think you're talking about something related to your account, etc. So we use that at that point to trigger that response. Then we've got confidence 70 plus, we've got your flow counter here. If it equals 2 or more, if it equals 2 less. And then we've got the response right there. In the middle, we've got that mid-confidence flow, which, you know, are you talking about this? So if you want to see these.
A little bit more organized too, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's way more organized. So just confirm you're talking about intent. Before we go on, can I confirm you're talking about this intent? And, you know, in this instance, you know, oh, I don't have the right, oh no, whoops, wrong one. Everyday rewards points. And then we've got your global fallback flow, which is, you know, here's our fallback counter. If the intent category is app, account, app, card, points, etc., etc. And we have these kind of stock standard responses here that we give to the user.
Do you share these real-time prototypes with stakeholders? Like, do you use the shareable prototype link in terms of like the new workflow?
Yeah, definitely. So this prototype, this one which I'm designing at the moment, isn't 100% ready for stakeholder consumption yet, but essentially I'll just send over a prototype link and say, go forth and break it.
Go forth and break it. I like that.
And then I can, you know, see how they're using it and then adjust things and all that sort of thing. Yeah.
Very nice. Well, I appreciate you. I know we could probably talk about this and go into each one. I think this probably, you know, gives a nice overview for people just to kind of see the side by side. I mean, here, there's, yes, you're doing some setting for logic capacity here, but that's even the logic you're using here is like 14 blocks that you had to visualize within a static flowchart can now just happen within one step, all behind the scenes, that a stakeholder would never have to look at, right? Like a stakeholder going in and reading the key, they don't need to know setting and confidence. They just need to know, you know, what does that high fidelity prototype look like on the back end?
Exactly. So
yeah, no, thank you for being willing to jump in and show. I'll jump back into mine here, and I know we're right at almost the quarter to the hour here, so I do want to just maybe touch on general results that you've seen. I think anyone on this call or watching after the fact might be doing these types of conversations internally. It might be good to reference, hey, you know, someone else just did this and this is what they've seen. We can maybe expect something along this line. You know, any results that you've seen that you're, you know, open to sharing with people here?
Yeah, for sure. I think it is hard to quantify exactly. It's not like we've sat back and measured everything as we've gone. However, I do spend far less time in 1 to 2 hour meetings doing dev handoffs and all that sort of thing. So that time instead I spend doing design, which ultimately I think is better for the end customer experience. If I was to say a kind of rough number, probably about 30% less time on just, you know, with the whole handover process and all that sort of thing. And you know, rather than doing 5 to 6 reworks, we're probably looking at 2 to 3, and reworking itself isn't as difficult as what it used to be in a flowchart, where if we had to change some logic and all that sort of stuff and everything that connects to it, it becomes much more of a bigger beast.
Yeah, that's fair. We just had a good question too. Will asked, how complex are your designs that you've done in Voiceflow? I think you hit a little bit on like the increased complexity, but for Will's sake, maybe you can give a little bit more context of like what you're able to do now.
Yeah, for sure. Some design, I mean, the developers in my team will tell you that I design things that are too complex. But yeah, like they can be. I mean, I think the best example is I recently, again, to show that you could design the complex things that we have in flowcharts, I recently redesigned being able to do a refund. Um, to give an example of how complex that is, I think I have an if block which is connected to other if blocks because we broke the amount of pieces of logic that you can have, but that has, I think, something like 75 different variables.
Oh,
And I think from memory, that is for the different types of refund reasons. So, you could say it's wet, it's moldy, it's blah, blah, blah. And we understand all those different reasons. And then when referencing the problem with the product, we go back and say, I'm sorry, it was moldy. I'm sorry, it was wet.
yeah.
So yeah.
And you can pass that variable on to the future part of the conversation, which again, I think it's interesting because we reframe it again of like scaling the workflow. You need to be able to boil that design speak into like a one-liner, right? And it's like you're able to design more complex, which on the surface sounds like, oh, more complex, more time. No, like I'm able to create more contextual, complex conversations for the customer versus just rote, 4-step tree-based conversations maybe that we used to only be able to do.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, 100%.
One other thing too that you had hit on is it wasn't like you were maybe scaling your team like triple the head count, but you were able to include more people in on the process, which I think is actually a pretty big point for pitching a new workflow to other teams, right? Of like, I'm going to be able to include a bot specialist. I'm going to be able to include a dev on this process, which ultimately makes everyone's life easier versus, this idea of like, we're going to triple our team headcount. That might not always be a priority for some teams, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. So I mean, since I've joined, we've had one new designer join the team. Shouts to Ali. And then we also, in the design process now, we work more closely with our bot trainers than we did. Our is probably not the right word, with the bot trainers that work with us. So the bot trainer that I work with, we kind of work hand in glove with each other. She adds lots of training phrases as we're going. She also tests things. And as part of her job, because she's, I guess, a product specialist as well, she fact checks a lot of the stuff that I do and goes in and breaks things and does that whole thing.
Okay, good to know. Well, that's very helpful. I want to open it up at the end here to any other questions. If anyone wants to raise their hand and hop on audio or video, awesome. Otherwise, drop them in the chat. I did collect a few questions from LinkedIn, oddly enough, from the comments section. So I'll start there. If anyone has any questions, though, feel free to raise your hand and before we wrap up. Great. So one of the questions that I saw on LinkedIn actually when we were talking about this event was, it's great to go through a redesign of a system, right? You know it because you saw old and new, but then you go through and then you even convinced people who were doing the old to jump on the new. But what happens when you start hiring new designers? What does that like onboarding package look like? And how have you approached that maybe other people can think ahead about before they go through a whole redesign of a workflow?
Yeah, for sure. So we haven't so far had a prerequisite to be able to use Voiceflow. So I just really spent the time with Ali, our other designer, and answered questions and showed her why an if block is broken or those sorts of things. I think because conversation design tools are relatively new, it's really about just being patient and working with someone so that they can use the tool just as good as you. I think most conversation designers probably aren't as weird as I am, and I just started like obsessively using Voiceflow and trying to like work out how to do everything. I just
No, that's
I'd spend like after work before my kid was born, I would sometimes just be like nutting out of flow and being like, why does this logic not work? And why, you know, just doing trial and error, you know, trying to get those 1,000 hours so that I can become a master of it.
Yeah.
Braden, Braden remembers it.
Braden remembers. Yeah, he's in the chat there. And I think you hit on a good point there. It's like, it's one thing to be a champion of a tool or a workflow. Obviously, there's only a few people like that in each company or team. But sometimes when someone joins, especially in a design role that maybe didn't exist, you know, in the way it does now 5 years ago, it's more about best practices of conversation design and then also the tool and the way we work. But you have to kind of in tandem educate and up level on the practice as well as the tooling, obviously, that goes with it, which a champion is also going to be a lead in doing.
Yeah. So and I think like a good example of that is, you know, at Woolies, we have a kind of, we want to create a pipeline for how to become a conversation designer, from becoming a bot trainer or bot specialist, and then giving people, if they want that career path, to become a conversation designer. So, you know, I'm starting to work with the bot specialists that I work with quite closely in teaching them how to use Voiceflow and conversation design in general. We're using the 100 days of voice challenge to create flows so that she can get a kind of better idea of how to do conversation design and how to approach it.
Yeah, that's a great tip. And just, yeah, engaging beyond just the flows that maybe you're working on for one use case, but opening that up a bit makes sense. Great. Any other questions? Feel free. Oh, we got a question from Sarah here. Have you found that as you start to think about conversation design specialization, specialization at Woolies, like copywriters versus builders versus those focused more on NLU, or right now are you kind of thinking about, you know, the whole umbrella still?
Yeah, I think at Woolies, I'll steal Greg Bennett's thing, but our conversation designers are that kind of full stack conversation designers. So we do copywriting, design, work on the NLU part, probably not as much because we have trainers as well, but we do work on it quite a lot as well.
Okay, good to know. Well, great. We're approaching the top of the hour here. We'll let you get started with your morning. I do want to do a quick plug of our next conversation in 2 weeks. We're going to be talking with Daniel, who leads customer experience on our team. Kind of a continuation of this conversation, but more of a larger understanding of the process in conversational AI, not just design, but just understanding how mature you are right now and where do you want to go on a matrix of different steps that a team can take. So that's going to happen in 2 weeks on a Thursday, not a Tuesday, a Thursday next time. And we'll be dropping a link to that in the email with a recording of today's talk. Big shout out to you, Peter. Thank you for joining early your time and sharing all your expertise. Hopefully people give you a follow on LinkedIn and learn more as you drop some more conversation design nuggets moving forward.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you both.